Okay, so in this lecture, I want to talk about ethical egoism, and I want to talk about a specific form of ethical egoism, Epicureanism. So, ethical egoism is the claim that we should be self interested, we should act for selfish or self interested reasons. So, why in the world spend any time on ethical egoism? Look, if strong psychological egoism were true, then obviously any good moral theory would have to be a form of ethical egoism, because any good moral theory would have to give us reasons to do whatever that we could actually follow. If we could only be selfish and a moral theory told us to give up our self-interest, that wouldn't work. So if strong psychological egoism were true, any good moral theory would have to give us selfish or self-interested reasons to be moral. Well, as I said in the last recording, there's no good reason to think that strong psychological egoism is true. So why then take any time with ethical egoism? Well, look, I think there are a few things that make ethical egoism attractive. One is just this simple fact that it often is rational to act in self-interest. All things being equal, it makes sense to act from self-interest. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by rational? What do I mean it makes sense? Well, look, if you do something and I challenge you, I'm saying, well, why'd you do that? If you want to show me that what you did makes sense, that it was a sensible and not a silly thing to do, not a mistake, you can cite self-interest, right? If someone asks you, well, why are you taking this college class? You can say, well, I want to earn my degree, I'll earn more money. That makes sense of what you're doing. It shows that it's a perfectly rational, sensible thing to do. Or if you say, well, look, I take this class at ESCC, it's a bit cheaper there than it is at the four-year university, I get my gen ed requirements down, I save all this money getting my bachelor's degree. You've cited self-interested reasons. You've also shown that what you're doing makes sense. That's all it is to say something is rational, is to say that it makes sense, that it's justified in some sense, right? Well, look, we'll talk about this as we go on, but hopefully we think it makes sense, we think it's rational to do what morality tells us to do, right? We think that that also justifies what we're doing. Why did you take all this effort to call up this person whose wallet you found? Well, it's the morally right thing to do. But the thing is, it looks like morality and self-interest are often in conflict. Makes sense, all other things being equal, to do what is in your self-interest. Well, it also hopefully makes sense to do what morality says. Well, you have these two different things that make sense. They run up against each other. And if you're going to say, well, morality should always trump self-interest, you have to give me a reason that morality is so important that doing what it says is justified over doing what this other thing that seems rational to do, seems justified to do says. If you're an ethical egoist, you don't have to do that. You don't have to explain why morality is so important that it should just trump or override self-interest. You can say, well, morality and self-interest actually go in the same direction. They're the same thing. You don't have this split between morality and self-interest. You don't have this conflict if you're a successful ethical egoist. It also seems, in a very real way, look, we have this temptation to do the morally wrong thing because the morally wrong thing seems like it's in our self-interest, right? I find the wallet, I don't want to spend the time returning it, and I want to keep the $500. There is a very real temptation not to do the right thing there. If I could show that self-interest also says to do the right thing, well, we could get rid of this temptation. We could show that, well, there's really no reason not to do what morality tells you to do because the conflict between it and self-interest, well, it's only an apparent one. It's not real. Okay, then, so having set up ethical egoism, shown why it's attractive, well, why aren't we all ethical egoists? Well, the problem is ethical egoism looks completely ridiculous. It looks completely ridiculous as a moral theory. And the reason is it's pretty darn clear that what's in our interest isn't the right thing to do, at least in some cases. Let me give you guys an example. Let's suppose, look, I'm not a horrible person, I wouldn't do this, but let's suppose that I'm in line to inherit millions of dollars. I have a rich uncle, I'm in his will for millions of dollars, but the thing is, I'm the second person in the will. The first person in the will who is in line to inherit it is a younger nephew that he likes more. If something happens to that younger nephew, well, I inherit the money. If not, well, he inherits the money. I still have to work for a living, right? Well, look, if I were to ask myself, well, what's the morally right thing to do? If I had a chance to kill my younger cousin, should I do it? Look, if you're not a sociopath, if you're a normal person, you'd say, for goodness sake, that is not the morally right thing to do. You're a monster. Well, but if you're an ethical egoist, what's the right thing to do? Should you kill your young nephew for money? Should you, say, volunteer to babysit and then he meets with an accident? Well, it looks like what the ethical egoist is going to say is, well, could you get away with it? Also, how much do you really want that money? If you could get away with it and you really want that money, then yeah, killing him is the morally right thing to do. That is completely insane, right? Any moral theory that would tell us we should murder an innocent person for money, that's not a good moral theory. That's a pretty good sign that moral theories went off the rails. You know, we can think of other, maybe not so hair-raising examples. Should you keep the money in the wallet? Should you try to get in touch with the person? Well, what do you think the chances the person will give you even more for returning their wallet than they would if you kept the money? Otherwise, keep the money, right? Pretty clear this isn't a good moral theory because we know what a good moral theory should tell us. And if a moral theory gives us stupid answers, that's a very good sign it's a bad moral theory. All right. So should we just discard ethical egoism? Should we just decide this is a really stupid account of ethics? There is this conflict between what morality says we should do and what self-interest says we should do. Well, maybe not. Maybe we should be... I think in the end, ethical egoism isn't going to be a great moral theory, but let's give it a fair shake. I think there's something worth doing there. So Epicureanism, and the letter I had you guys read, is an example of Epicureanism. It's very short, but it's a very nice statement of Epicureanism. Epicureanism is a form of ethical egoism. But I think it makes sense to call Epicureanism enlightened ethical egoism. The Epicurean will say ethical egoism looks bad. It looks like a stupid account of morality because most people don't have a very good idea of what self-interest is. If you really know what's in your self-interest, it turns out, A, that self-interest is very much different from what we usually think it is, and B, the Epicurean will say there's no conflict between self-interest, if we understand it correctly, and doing the morally right thing. The key, though, is to understand self-interest correctly, or so the Epicurean will say. Well, then what is self-interest? We talk of selfishness, we talk of self-interest, and we think we're pretty clear on what we mean by it, right? But what do we really mean by it? What is really in someone's interest? What makes someone's life go well? If you're self-interested, you should try to get the most of what's in your interest, what makes your life go well. But then the huge question is, what is that? What is in someone's interest? What does in fact make their life go well? And so one answer here, well, it's in your interest to just get whatever you want. Your life goes well, someone else's life goes well when you get what you want, or someone else's life goes well when they get what they want. The more of what you want that you get, the better your life goes. So if you're self-interested, try to get the most of what you want. Problem with that is there's a lot of counterexamples to it. And let me pause for just a few seconds, and you guys should think of this. What are some counterexamples to this claim that getting what you want or someone getting what they want makes your life go well when you get what you want, or them getting what they want makes their life go well? Are there any counterexamples to that claim? Well, there are. Think about this. I had a friend once and he said, well, what I want most in the world is to marry my fiancée, Adrian. That's the thing I want. And all of us who knew this guy were like, oh goodness, you don't want to do that. She uses you for free labor. She basically used him as a contractor to work on our house. She didn't pay. She insulted him. She treated him like he was an idiot. He thought that he wanted to marry this woman, the love of my life. But as a matter of fact, it would be really bad for him. And look, you might have been in relationships like that yourself. You think at the time, what I want most in the world is to marry this person. You break up, you're depressed for a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever. And then one day you wake up and you're like, oh, thank God, that would have been terrible. I wanted it. It would be awful for me. Well, let me give you another example, right? Someone who's a heroin addict, well, what do they want? They want heroin. Does their life go better when they get more heroin? Is it in their interest to get more heroin? No, it's not, right? Someone probably betray that, I don't know, watch too much junk TV, but if you watch like Hoarders, you watch this A&E show, which I shouldn't watch, but I do, these people think that what's in their self-interest is keeping all this junk in their house. They really don't want to get rid of it. By the end of the show, they see, oh yeah, well, keeping, stained teddy bears from the 1980s, that's really not good for me. I thought I wanted to do this. I thought it was in my self-interest to keep this thing. It's not. My life will go better if I clean all this junk out. The heroin addict's life would go better if he cleaned up. A lot of people in bad relationships, even though they want to be with this person, their life would go better if they broke up, if they don't keep on with it, right? So getting what you want seems like a very bad account of self-interest because there are a lot of examples where getting what someone wants is not good for them. And so the Epicurean will say, well, yeah, okay, that's clear. You can see that getting whatever it is you want is a bad account of self-interest. Well, the first step for a good ethical egoism, for a plausible ethical egoism, is to give a better account of what's good for somebody, what's in their interest. Well, the Epicurean would say the answer to this, it isn't getting what you want. We see that that's bad. The answer to this is happiness. What makes your life go well? Happiness. What makes anyone's life go well? Happiness. What's good for somebody? Happiness. Well, you might say, well, what do you guys mean by happiness? The Epicurean will say happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain in the long term. If you are a good Epicurean, the more pleasure you have and the less pain, the better your life goes, the better it is. In fact, the Epicureans don't quite talk like this, but I don't think it's unfair to give them this view. If you're an Epicurean, you can almost think of pleasure as the number with the plus sign in front of it, pain as the number with the minus sign in front of it, or pleasure as the black number, pain as the red number in your sort of accounting book. You want that number with the plus sign, that number in black, to be as high as possible. You want that number with the minus sign, that number in red, to be as low as possible. And it's in the long term. Well, let's think about how this Epicurean account does with the cases that we considered, right? If you are an Epicurean, how would you explain why staying in a relationship with someone who's awful to you, even if you think you want it, why would you as an Epicurean think it's not in your self-interest? Think about that for a second. Well, because you get less happiness, you get a lot less pleasure and a lot more pain from being in this relationship than you would from not being in this relationship or being in a relationship with someone who treats you better. Well, why is heroin? Why is doing heroin not a good account of what's in someone's interest, even if they really, really want to do heroin? Well, because by doing heroin, they might get a lot of pleasure. I mean, I've never done heroin. I imagine it's pretty pleasant, but it also sets up a lot of pain, right? Being addicted to anything in the long term is not a very pleasant life. You, if you were addicted to heroin, are going to feel a lot of pain that you wouldn't if you weren't addicted to heroin. So why is heroin addiction a bad idea? In the long term, you get less pleasure and certainly a lot more pain than you would if you weren't addicted to heroin. So hopefully you guys start to get a sense of how the Epicurean deals with these cases, right? Getting what you want might not be good for you because it might bring you more pain, it might deprive you of pleasure. Okay, so let's look at how the Epicurean thinks of their ethical egoism. Well, the Epicurean will say, once you realize that what's in someone's interest is pleasure and the absence of pain, you can see that self-interest, rational self-interest, enlightened self-interest, they might say, looks a lot different than you might think it would. We might think that a self-interested person will go after power over others, money, luxuries, things like that, right? In my first example, I use me as an example. I wouldn't do this, but you might think of the horrible cousin killing his cousin for money. Well, he thinks that's self-interest because he wants money, right? The Epicurean will say that wouldn't happen if you're really smart about self-interest, because an intelligent, a rational, and enlightened person pursuing their self-interest, they'll see that power, money, luxuries aren't really in their self-interest. Well, why not? Well, think about it this way. Why might it not be pleasurable? Why might it create a lot of pain to go after power over others? Pain for you, not others, pain for you. Well, look, what kinds of things do you generally have to do to get power over other people? You generally have to do a lot of work. You generally have to do a lot of unpleasant work. Not only that, you make a lot of enemies. Well, think about tales of dictators. They always have to be on the lookout for the guy in the palace who wants to literally stick a knife in their back and take over, right? Well, if you have a lot of power, maybe you're not a dictator, maybe you're just the guy in charge of the company, someone is always going to be willing to stab you in the back to take what you have, right? And you're probably going to, even people who aren't that mean, doing the things you need to do to get power, you're going to make a lot of enemies who want to stab you in the back to get even. So pleasure and the absence of pain, is power a good way to have that? Nope. You're going to have a lot less pleasure and a lot more pain in the form of psychological pain, anxiety, worry at the very least, than you would if you didn't go after power. You might, especially if you're the dictator in some country, you might have real physical pain when someone literally sticks that knife in, right? If you're, say, a manager of a company, physical pain's pretty unlikely, but, you know, when your enemies get even and you're fired from the company and maybe left holding the bag for something terrible, you're going to feel a lot of mental pain, right? Well, what about money? People think that it's in their self-interest to go after money. Well, why would the Epicureans say that's not true? Think about the jobs you generally have to do to get a lot of money. They're generally not a lot of fun, right? And you work very, very long hours. Well, isn't there stuff, I know a guy, a friend of mine, he's a lawyer. He told me how much he made every year. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I went into the wrong profession. Then he told me how much he worked. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm so happy that I went into the profession I went into. He was very happy. He's like, yeah, this Saturday, I'm only going to have to go in for work 4 hours. I'll be off by noon. I'll be home by 1. It's going to be great. And I'm like, okay, you make a lot more than I do. It's not worth it, right? And he works even less than some people do, right? He only works 60 or 70 hours a week. Some people work 80. Well, there are things you could be doing that are a lot more pleasant than at your law firm writing motions at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning, right? Or if you're a businessman, there are things you could be doing at 9 p.m. on a Thursday night that are a lot more pleasant than dealing with the fact that the market might be doing X or Y. So pursuing money is not likely to bring you the most pleasure and the least pain. Now, the Epicurean will say you need some money. They're not stupid. But how much? They'll say, well, if you're really smart about it, very little. Well, what about luxuries? Luxuries like, well, nice food, nice drink, a really big, pretty house, a nice car. I mean, the Epicureans, they lived thousands of years ago, so the car wasn't an issue for them. But the rest of this, they would think about. And they'll say, well, look, think about what happens with a luxury. Imagine that you get a really nice car. It's going to make you happy for a little while. Imagine that you can drink champagne whenever you want, and you can eat lobster for every meal or steak or whatever. Well, that's going to bring you some short-term pain or pleasure, but what's going to happen? Well, you're going to get to the point that the nice car, the lobster, the champagne, or the really big house, that's the standard. It's not going to make you happy anymore, but you're going to be miserable if you don't have it. If you have to eat hamburger or drink Pabst Blue Ribbon for a meal or just water, you're going to be miserable. Well, hey, guess what? The way human life actually is, it's pretty unlikely that you will always be able to afford these luxuries. Luxuries, going after them, pursuing them, are a bad bet because a little bit of pleasure in the short term, then you get used to them and you don't even really get that much pleasure from them anymore, but you in a sense become addicted to them, and if you don't have them, you're miserable. Given the way human life is, there's a pretty good chance you won't be able to always get them. you are really setting yourself up for misery by going after luxuries. So the Epicurean will say, a life really devoted to pursuing self-interest, it's going to look a lot different than you think. It's actually going to be a life where we don't pursue money, power, or luxuries. It'll actually be a life of pretty simple desires and pleasures. What would an Epicurean say about my example of someone who kills someone for money? The Epicurean would say, well, that's stupid. That's not good self-interest. This person cares too much about money, so they're not understanding what their self-interest is. And the fact that they care too much about money, well, they're doing all this other stuff that might set them up for misery because there's a good chance they'll get caught. It's not going to be pleasant going to jail, right? So the Epicurean will say, the real life of self-interest looks a lot simpler than we think. The real life of self-interest isn't doing horrible things to get money, power, and luxuries because, well, that's not going to bring you as much happiness as you think. It'll bring you a lot more misery. Well, and the Epicurean, you might say, well, okay, so the selfish person won't be a complete jerk, but don't we think that we should be concerned for others sometimes? And the Epicurean will say, well, of course. And, sorry, my dog is, well, you can hear her. She's very zealous. So anyway, the Epicurean will say, they can even give a good account of why we should have friends. Well, why is that? Why would having friends be in your self-interest? It certainly looks like some of the things you might have to do to keep friends, well, that's not going to be in your self-interest, right? Your friend wants you to help him move. Nobody likes to help somebody move. How is that going to be in your self-interest? Well, think about it this way. What would a life without friends be like? One of the reasons we have friends is that friends make us happy, right? It's pleasant to have friends. If you didn't have friends, your life would be a lot less pleasant than it is with friends. So, look, the Epicurean could say, well, you have good selfish reasons to want to have friends. And then you say, well, why should I do things for my friends that I don't find terribly pleasant? Well, think of it this way, right? If you didn't do these things, could you really keep your friends? You know, if you didn't help your friends move, you probably couldn't keep the friendship, right? So the Epicurean will say, well, you know, you do these things, they make sense to do, even if it's a short-term sacrifice of pleasure, because in the long term, it brings you more pleasure. So hopefully that makes sense. The Epicurean could even say, well, here's a reason to help your friends out. Here's a reason to be selfless. Because in the long term, it brings you more pleasure. It helps you avoid pain, right? Friends are good to help you avoid pain. When you run into trouble, it's good to have friends around who can help you out. All right. So hopefully, I hope you guys can see why ethical egoism looks a lot different than we might think. But is ethical egoism, even in the form the Epicurean gives us, is it a good moral theory? Well, maybe not. Okay, so now that I have my tiny little dog calmed down, hopefully we can finish the lecture. She's very zealous to defend me from the KitchenAid mixer that I actually ordered being delivered. Great to have a dog, right? Anyway, so to finish the lecture, look, as I was saying, ethical egoism, even in the enlightened form the Epicurean gives us, they can do better than I think we would imagine, telling us why what seems like the morally right thing to do and why self-interest really aren't as divergent, don't come apart as much as we might think. But is Epicureanism, is ethical egoism of the form they present, is it a good moral theory? I think the answer is going to have to be no. Well, so why then do I say that the answer is going to have to be no for the Epicurean, for this form of ethical egoism? Well, think about this. Look, even if we have this enlightened view of self-interest, a lot of times what's morally right and what's going to bring us the most pleasure and the least pain, us personally, that's going to be different. I mean, think of it this way, right? The Epicurean can show why I might have friends, why I need friends, and why it will make sense for me to sometimes sacrifice my self-interest for those friends. Well, but can he always do that? Imagine that I have a friend and he is deathly ill. He's dying. He's in the hospital. And it would really make him happier. It would make his passing a lot easier if people were to visit him. Should I visit him? Well, in the Epicurean theory, maybe not, right? Clearly the morally right thing to do if you have a good friend who's dying, who you could ease their pain by visiting them, you ought to do it. Well, but if you're an Epicurean, you say, well, it makes sense to sacrifice for friends to, preserve the relationship because it's pleasant having friends. But this person, well, they're going to die anyway. Am I going to be able to preserve the relationship? No. So should you visit? It's hard to see how the Epicurean could avoid saying no. That's not the morally right thing to do, so it's a good sign that this is not a good moral theory. Let me give you guys another example, right? Imagine that someone says to me, I don't know, this would be like the worst James Bond villain ever. This is really stupid, but philosophers use outlandish examples a lot of times. It's just part of the field, so humor me. Imagine someone says to me, I'll give you a choice. I'm going to break your pinky finger, have my henchman break your pinky finger, or I'm going to set off a bomb that I rigged up in a village half the world away and kill all these people you've never met. Well, look, obviously it would really hurt to have my finger broken, but I should say go ahead and break my finger. Better you should do that than kill a lot of people. What would the Epicurean say, though? Well, if I said to this really lousy supervillain I've imagined, I'm like, well, are you going to make me watch when you set the bomb off? And he says, well, no. And I'm going to say, well, I don't know these people. And he says, well, no. And I'm like, well, maybe going to have to hear about it. And he says, well, not unless you read the newspaper tomorrow. I'm like, okay, I won't do that. I was like, just blow the people up. Keep my TV off for a few days. I don't want to hear about it. It'll pass. I don't know them. How's it going to bring me pain if these people suffer? It's obviously going to bring me pain if you break my pinky finger. Blow up the village. Well, clearly that's the wrong thing to say, but it seems pretty clear that even the enlightened form of ethical egoism the Epicurean gives us, it's going to say do it, so it seems like ethical egoism is not a good theory. Now, later in the semester, we'll talk about virtue theory, and one of the things the virtue theorists will try to do, one of the things Aristotle and Aristotelians will try to do, is to give us an account of self-interest that they think is better than the Epicureans. And one of the ways to read virtue theory is maybe showing that if you get an even better account of self-interest than pleasure and the absence of pain, then maybe you can show that what is in our self-interest and what's morally right really aren't that different. But so far with the account of self-interest the Epicurean gives us, they haven't given us a form of ethical egoism that's a plausible ethical theory. So I say, let's leave ethical egoism behind for now.